of the year. We're halfway through 2024. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, a word about next month, July 11th. Mark that down on your calendar because the first Thursday next month will be July 4th and we won't be here. July 11th, our speaker will be Nancy Lowe, and their topic will be organize like an archivist. I guess organizing and genealogy research just don't go that well together. Lorene was telling us tonight that she met someone in the room that
We've had a couple of patrons lately to come in and put the rest of us to shame, because the one lady comes in, well, she's actually hoping to get into DAR, North American Revolution, so she's got all this documentation. Well, my documentation is here in that box and there in that box. She had this binder with all these things put in sleeves and categorized by the family and who they are. And we're kind of like, wow. So I was glad that Dan said, well, he's got someone to come and maybe help the rest of us figure out how to do some of this organization.
That will be on July 11th. Also, a word about the after meeting snacks. We are down to just one meeting that we do not have someone to show off their baking abilities, and that is in the month of November. And yes, if you sign up for November, we will remind you when November comes around. And should you not be able to attend that November meeting, even though you've committed to it here the 1st of June, we do have a backup plan, so let that not be a worry. Tonight's snacks have been provided by one of our newest members, our newest member, Bruce Bentley. So thank you very much, Bruce. Our speaker tonight joins us in person here from her hometown of San Francisco. Judy, by the way, presented to this group last when the library was on the other side of town.
Wow.
So it's been a while. Judy is a retired trial attorney. She practiced law in both California and Ohio, and in both federal and state court jurisdictions, so she knows her way around the court system. She's also a proud mother of 4 adopted children, so she has also personal experience with some of the court's special jurisdictions. Judy was born in San Francisco and moved back there after retiring. She's familiar, though, with the Central Valley. She feels like we should have invited her before the hottest day of the summer. She lived in Fresno from 1998 through 2015. She also has lots of family history in the area. Her wagon train family settled in Mariposa. Her great-great-grandmother is buried in Fresno, and her great-great-great-grandfather is buried right here in Tulare. So tonight's program is about mining the gold that's within the court system. Please join me in welcoming Judy.
You know, I had no idea before I started doing genealogy that I had any connection with the Central Valley. And so it was such a shock to me when all these people that I could trace back to are buried in your cemeteries all over the place. So, and then I moved from Ohio to California because I got a great job offer in Fresno. My expectation at the time was that since all of my family was up around San Francisco, my expectation was that I would come out, I'd work in Fresno for a while, and then I'd see if I could transfer up to San Francisco. But I actually got roots set in Fresno, and I was there for a lot of years and didn't leave until I retired. So I have nothing but good things to say about the Central Valley except about the weather. So I have some handouts for everybody. I'll just, yeah, thanks. So let me say to start with that we have a very complicated system of judicial administration in the United States. There are numerous courts, each with its own jurisdiction, focus, authority, and powers. Today I want to provide you with a broad overview.
Oh, no, it's okay.
I prepared some handouts, which are being circulated to you now, and they summarize the points that I'm going to try to make here. So I hope you find them helpful. Let me start out by saying that we have parallel court systems. There are state courts and there are federal courts. And I want to distinguish between the two of those for you. Federal courts hear cases that are based on federal laws that were enacted by the U.S. Congress and federal regulations that were promulgated by federal agencies. For example, Congress has passed tax laws, and the IRS has developed rules and regulations to administer the tax laws. Congress has passed environmental laws, and the Environmental Protection Agency implements them with environmental regulations. So if you had a case that was based on tax law or environmental law, you would find that case would be properly filed in federal court. State courts handle cases that are based on state laws and that were enacted by state legislatures, state regulations that were promulgated by state agencies, and local ordinances that were passed by local governing bodies such as the California Department of Insurance, the Department of Motor Vehicles, the Franchise Tax Board, or the various counties' boards of supervisors. So what happens when you have a case that has both federal and state claims in it? What court does it end up in? There are a whole bunch of different factors that play into figuring out which court a case that has both types of claims in it go. There's no overriding consideration, so each case is going to be determined on its the facts and sometimes on the strategies. The plaintiff would be the person who has a claim and they're suing somebody else. The plaintiff is the one that has the first opportunity to decide what court their case is going to be brought in. They file it in their preferred court. Now, sometimes there are challenges, and I should move this on to this. Sometimes there are challenges, and the opposing party, tries to get it bounced to the other court system. But each one of those, as I said, is going to be fact-driven. So, what is most important about this subject is to know that if you have a case that has both federal and state claims in it, federal courts have jurisdiction, have authority to adjudicate state law claims, and state law courts have the jurisdiction to adjudicate federal claims. So if it's a combined case, then the judge is empowered to resolve all the claims that are in that one case. So let's talk about levels of judicial review. Both federal and state courts have 3 levels of judicial review. The first is the trial court, where cases are initially filed and they come into the judicial review process. Those are known as courts of original jurisdiction. Next, there are appellate courts. Every claimant in court has an automatic right to one appeal. It's an absolute right that at least one court will review your trial court. But a party wanting to have a further review, jump to another jurisdiction, a higher level of appellate jurisdiction, has to petition that higher level of review to the court, and it's up to the court's discretion whether or not they'll take it. In fact, when you file for that second level of review, you're going to go to your highest court. It's called a writ of certiorari, a writ asking the court to take the case up from the appellate court, the first level of appeal. Sometimes we just call it shorthand writ of cert. Very few writs of cert are actually granted. Thousands are filed every year in both state courts and federal courts, and only a handful are actually heard. If you ever hear somebody say, I'm prepared to take my case all the way to the Supreme Court, it's not really up to them. They can take their case all the way to the appellate court, but after that, it's up to the Supreme Court or the highest level of reviewing court in the state to decide whether or not they'll take it. So let's talk about the different names that we have for the courts. In the federal court system, the trial court is called the district court. The first reviewing court, your first appellate court, is called the circuit court. And the highest court is the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you. It's dry in Valley today. In the state courts, we have more variety of names for courts. The trial court is called the Superior Court, or sometimes the Court of Common Pleas. In California, we call them Superior Courts. The reviewing court is typically called the Court of Appeals, and the highest court would be the state Supreme Court. That's sort of a rule of thumb, but there are plenty of variations on that among the different courts, among the different courts and states. For example, in South Carolina, the trial court for civil cases is called the Court of Common Pleas, but the trial court for criminal cases is known as the Court of General Sessions. Louisiana calls its trial courts district courts, and its appellate courts circuit courts. New York totally confuses everything. They call their trial courts Supreme Courts, their reviewing court the appellate division of the Superior Court, and their highest court is known as the Court of Appeals. So I recommend, before you start looking into court records, find out the designation of the courts in the jurisdiction where you're looking. And that would mean, you can find this out with a simple Google search. So that would mean you'd want to look for both what do they call their state courts and what do they call their federal courts. Okay, let's move on to civil versus criminal. These are two very broad categories, but they define really all cases are either civil or criminal. Criminal cases involve investigations and arrests by police authorities, and then prosecution. A federal case involves violation of a federal criminal law, such as kidnapping, bank robbery, illegal firearms, or tax evasion. These cases are investigated by the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they're prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's offices. A state criminal case involves violation of state criminal laws, such as homicide, robbery, fraud, or embezzlement. They're investigated by the local police authorities, and they're prosecuted by local prosecutors' offices. Criminal matters will typically result in finding a person to be either guilty or not guilty. If guilty, the accused person faces incarceration or criminal money fines. Federal crimes are punishable by confinement in federal prisons. State crimes can lead to imprisonment in a state prison or confinement in a local jail. Civil cases involve disputes or claims between two citizens, where one person sues the other and typically is seeking an award of money damages to compensate for the injury that they sustained. Whether the case is brought in federal or state court, the complaining party is called the plaintiff and the answering party is called the defendant. Usually, for a civil case to proceed in a federal court, at least one claim in it must be based on federal law. Otherwise, all civil cases must be brought in state courts. The exception is what the federal courts call diversity cases. In a diversity case, each of the parties must be a citizen of different states. They can proceed in the federal courts then, so that there is no suggestion that the local state courts will be biased towards the party that comes from that state. The expectation is that the federal courts will be more neutral when there's a diversity of citizenship situation. Now I want to talk a little bit about courts of limited or special jurisdiction. So the cases we've been talking about are cases of general jurisdiction. That means the courts have broad authority to rule on every kind of issue and controversy that is raised. But there's also courts of limited jurisdiction. They only have authority to hear particular defined kinds of cases and make rulings on them. For example, among the federal courts, we have bankruptcy courts. They just rule on matters arising in bankruptcy proceedings. We also have the Court of Claims in Washington, D.C., which I bet a lot of you have never even heard of. This would be the court you have to go to in Washington, D.C. if you have a claim against the United States government for money damages. You cannot file it in any of your local courts. You have to file it in Washington, D.C. There's also administrative law courts, such as immigration courts, that deal with immigration and asylum matters, and Social Security courts for disability claims. I also added to the list vaccine courts, just because we've heard so much about vaccines in the last couple of years. And I will bet you that nobody had ever heard of a vaccine court. It's the forum you have to go to if you have a claim of injury or death arising from the administration of a vaccine. The program became effective in 1988 as a no-fault program where petitions for monetary compensation are swift, flexible, and less adversarial. The alternative would be to go as if you had a personal injury case, and you have to have medical experts and all kinds of medical records brought in, and they're very complicated and based on a lot of science, and they take a long time and they cost a lot of money because experts are very expensive. So if you go to the vaccine court, it's really a matter, the court is going to make a determination if your injury was related to the vaccine, and if so, they're going to come up with a dollar amount that they think is reasonable. It's going to be less than you would get if you had a similar injury based on a personal injury claim, but you're not going to have all the expenses associated with paying a lawyer and paying all the court costs and paying the expert witnesses. In addition to some courts of general, did I skip a page here? No. State courts of general jurisdiction are divided sometimes into separate departments, one being criminal and one being civil. And each maintains their own set of records. So when you're doing your research, you might have to investigate records that are in one particular court system, but could be filed with the criminal docket or could be filed with the civil docket. So you're going to want to be able to figure out where's the best place to go when you're trying to dig up records. Because records typically, court records, unless it's a very recent case that's still subject to appeal, after like 3 or 4 years, all the court records are going to go off-site to a storage facility because there's just so many records that are generated by the amount of litigation that's brought. And so you don't want to be going in archives to try to find get your records, and you send them to the wrong place because it'll be just time-consuming and frustrating. So there are also, as far as courts of special jurisdiction that are at the state level, you have family law courts that deal with divorce paternity, spousal and child support, custody, and visitation. You have probate courts that deal with wills and the administrations of estates, questions of mental competence, and guardianship of children. And you have juvenile courts that deal with delinquency, child welfare matters, such as foster care. In most states, you will find the courts of limited or special jurisdiction that are listed on these charts. But they sometimes have slightly different names. For example, in New York, the probate court is called the surrogates court. But they typically have a similar authority to handle the specific type of litigation. You might notice that even though in the introduction, you had mentioned I have adopted kids, I don't have adoptions anywhere up there, and I wanted to explain that. And this is important when you're doing your genealogy research and you end up with an adoption situation in your family lines. They're handled differently depending on the different state courts' jurisdictions. In some states, adoption cases are assigned to family law courts, and in others, they're in probate courts. If you have a program that's a foster care, foster to adopt, where people take in kids from the foster care system and then want to adopt them and make them a permanent part of their family, those adoptions are processed through the foster care system. So you would go to the court where the foster that has jurisdiction over foster care. In certain states, adoptions are actually also considered to be only allowed in courts of original jurisdiction. So they're on dockets of local superior courts and courts of common plea. So if you're looking for adoption records, you'll have to check with the court authority in the state where the adoption took place. Another thing about these issues that take it down to the county level, it used to be actually as an effort to protect the child and the mother that adoption records were all sealed. Nobody could find out, who the birth parents were. A lot of kids who were eligible for adoption were kids that were born out of wedlock, and so by making the adoption record sealed, it was intended to, first of all, half of the intent was to protect the mother's reputation for being an unwed mother, but also to protect the child from being considered to be a bastard and therefore a sort of a second-class citizen. So it was intended for good purposes, but then our life has gotten a lot more complicated. We do a lot more information sharing, and now a lot of people who have been adopted want to know about their backgrounds. And so if you were adopted, if the adoption took place in a county that still has closed adoption records, you can only get those records unsealed if you petition that court and give them a good reason why. You can't, as a genealogist, you can't go and say, I'm just curious, I'm tracing my family tree. A lot of times a very common reason that a person would give would be, I'm concerned about medical issues, what have I inherited, or what might I pass on to my own children. And there is some sympathy in the courts for that point of view, but a lot of courts still think that the secrecy is more important. I did one case, I had to file it up in San Mateo of a woman who wanted to get into DAR. She was adopted. She knew who her birth mother was because that had come out over the years from her adopted parents. But she didn't know who her birth father was, and the only record she had was a document from the adoption agency that only provided non-identifying information. And so I had to find a reason for asking to get that unsealed. And the county I was in was not interested in opening up records just for medical requirements. So I poured through this request, the document from the adoption agency, And I found one line that said that the birth father was Latino and possibly American Indian. And that was my hook, because I filed with the court in San Mateo, and I said, this person may have tribal rights, and tribal rights are super important. They have an opportunity to get land or opportunities to participate in tribal income, and they're also subject to tribal law, and which could have benefits for them. And so we got her records open. So anyway, let me now turn to some examples to show you what kinds of stuff you're going to find in court records. So this is all from my own research. This is a probate record of William Gann. He was one of my great-great-great-grandfathers on my father's side. He was born in Tennessee in 1792 and died in Missouri in 1845. This is a transcription of part of his probate file, which was filed in Missouri Probate Court. It identifies his wife and his children, which includes my ancestor, which is Margaret. It shows the married names of some of his daughters, and it shows where they all were living in 1845. So my Margaret married Miles Harless in Missouri and came to California in a wagon train in 1859. I have yet to find Margaret and Miles' marriage record, but since Margaret is listed here as Gann, it tells me that she married Miles sometime after these probate documents were filed. This petition also mentions that William died without a will, so I knew to stop looking for one, just to look at what the court record had. The files also includes inventories of personal possessions and of sales of both tanned and untanned leather. The kinds of tools and inventory of leather gives me a good idea that William was a tanner. An interesting fact just to build on your picture of the people that you're researching. Next one, this is Annie Peterson. This is a sort of a sad, but it's a probate matter from Massachusetts. Annie was my great-great-grandmother on my mother's side. Her husband came to America from Sweden in 1886, and she followed him with the children in 1887, but things didn't go well for her here. But this docket sheet involves the guardianship of an insane person. The file includes a doctor's detailed statement of Annie's mental health. It sounds like she may have had a stroke or an aneurysm that left her mentally damaged. But on one of my collateral lines, many of Annie's descendants have had serious mental illness, including my aunt, 2 of her daughters, and 2 of her granddaughters, all female. So these are tragic, and all these women had very difficult lives because of their mental issues, and it may be that this, now that we have DNA and we can look into things, it may be that this reflects some genetic issue that was going on that traces back to Annie Peterson. So this one, Robert McCaslin, my great-great-grandfather, another of my mother's lines. These are probate papers from the Surrogate Court of New York, December 1851. First, they identify Emmeline McCaslin as the widow of Robert. The children are identified. So you can maybe read it better. Andrew, William, Joseph, Phoebe, and Wright. Phoebe, 6 years old in the 1850 census, so about 7 at the time of the probate. She's not listed in any subsequent probate files, though, and she's not listed in any later censuses. I assume she died, but I haven't been able to locate a grave. In my search for Phoebe's grave, though, I found another child's grave. There's baby Robert McCaslin, buried with his father. The cemetery records show baby Robert was born in in January 1852, just 2 months after his father died. So Emmeline was pregnant when she was widowed. Baby Robert then died in September 1852, so he was just 8 months old. With respect to Robert and Emmeline's oldest son, Andrew, the probate file also includes a formal petition for Emmeline to be appointed as guardian of Andrew in 1855 when he was 17. He married shortly thereafter, so he must have needed his mother's formal consent since he was still so young. One of the things that was interesting about that is she had been named as his guardian. The fact that she was his mother wasn't good enough for her to have the authority to speak to legal issues on behalf of him, which shows how far behind women were at that point. Okay, adoptions. This is the adoption of Elsie Froland, Massachusetts, Norfolk County Probate and Family Court, 1892. I didn't find the whole file, but I found the docket sheet where Martin Froland and his wife Amanda adopted a little girl who they called Elsie. Elsie was born in 1888, so she was 4 years old when she was adopted. It's another of my Swedish lines, and she was a much-loved daughter. Martin was a rather prominent, became a very prominent citizen in Youngstown, and there was a lot of publicity about him. And when the family was referenced, Elsie was always named as his daughter. Okay. Andrew McCaslin in court. Let me turn to some of my more colorful ancestors. The oldest court records I found in my family history relate to Andrew McCaslin, my mother's great-great-grandfather. He was my brick wall. He still is my brick wall on the Castle line. I haven't found out where or when he was born or who his parents were. I've traced him back as far as 1804 in Westchester County, New York, with the birth of his first child. Birth year information in the later census records suggests Andrew was born between 1770 and 1775. But the cemetery records say he was 89 when he died in 1849, so that would make a birthday of 1760. That's a very typical issue that you find with doing genealogy. What I do know is that Andrew was a pretty raucous guy. This is my oldest court record from 1809. It's an ale piece to answer for his trespass against Simeon Dundee. I don't know if that was a trespass on real estate or a trespass on Simon's body. No other court records survive, but obviously Andrew and Simeon had some kind of dispute. This is a copyus, and it was issued against Andrew. A copyus is a writ to arrest. The sheriff wanted Andrew to answer for his trespass and assault and battery against Susanna Williams. That's a little alarming, that he might have been brutal to a woman. Okay, 1815 was not a good year for Andrew. Besides his difficulties with Susanna, a money judgment was entered against him on a promissory note. He's the court cover file. He only owed $38, but with all the additional court costs, it added up to $63 at the end. Then in 1823, another copyist, this one against Eli Travis for his assault on Andrew. I don't know who Simeon Dundee, Susanna Williams, or Sarah Reynolds were, but Eli Travis was part of Andrew's own family. He was the uncle of Andrew's son-in-law, David Travis, who married Andrew's oldest daughter. In 1823, Eli would have been 74 years old, and he was more than 10 years older than Andrew. It makes you wonder what could have aroused these elderly men so much that they got into a confrontation. my family lines, because the Gans, we mentioned before, William Gann, Montana. Well, Andrew stirred up his fair amount of trouble in Westchester County. The court records for my Gann family span 5 states, 6 if you count the short-lived state of Franklin separately, and include numerous generations, which means these are definitely my most colorful ancestors. A short aside about Franklin. Do you guys know about the state of Franklin? Do you know what that was? After the Revolutionary War, at the time of the Revolutionary War, North Carolina was divided by mountains, and there was a little western part that was about 1/3 of the territory of the state, and then the eastern side, which went from the mountains out to the Atlantic Ocean. During the Revolutionary War, there was, the capital and all the major politicians and all the legislature was on the east side, and so they focused all of their governing and lawmaking on what was needed for the people on the east side, and they focused the majority of their budget on spending money for the people on the east side. So you had the people, the older mountain people who were in the west side. It was called Washington County in North Carolina. And they got really upset that they got so little attention, so little money, so little military support. So when the war was over, they petitioned to become a state of their own, the state of Franklin. They submitted a petition to Congress, and they set up their own state government. They elected a governor and all the legislatures. The governor had 2 terms, and they did everything the state government would do. They regulated roads, they regulated postage, they collected taxes, they set up their own court system. But after the 2nd term, the governor didn't want to run anymore, and nobody else wanted to take his place. So the state of Franklin disappeared. So if you have people from the state of Franklin, and there's similar kinds of situations like where there's borders and disputed borders, and so at some point in time, this piece of real estate in the court systems of Missouri might apply, and other times it might be Kansas, and they go back and forth, and so you need to know the boundary lines of your where your people were in order to figure out which state court you should go to. So for Franklin, if it was after the land went back to North Carolina, all of the records from the state of Franklin went to North Carolina. But it didn't stay in North Carolina very long. Relatively shortly after that, North Carolina didn't want to deal with these people. So they ended up becoming part of Tennessee. So what was Washington County, North Carolina became Washington County, state of Franklin, which then became Washington County, North Carolina, which then became Washington County, Tennessee. So where your records are depends on who had jurisdiction during those times. So anyway, my Gans, they were just the most difficult people. On the other hand, it makes them really easy to follow because I have court records from all across the country. And sometimes they're criminal records, sometimes they're civil records. Sometimes they're suing each other, sometimes neighbors are suing. They're very colorful. So let me start with this. Extracts from Virginia court papers show that John Gann sued a neighbor in 1755 for trespass, and himself was sued by another neighbor in 1762. He was court-martialed in 1758 for missing a militia muster as well. Then between 1764 and 1766, he was sued 12 times by various creditors for failure to pay his promissory notes. Numerous other Gans besides John were called to answer for their aggressions against their neighbors and even some family members. For example, in 1752, Samuel Gann was charged with publishing false and defamatory words against John Morgan, accusing him of stealing silver spoons. In 1762, Clement Gann was charged twice with assaulting his neighbors. In 1806, another John Gann was accused of assault and battery, and several Gann brothers sued each other in Tennessee for failing to adequately care for their widowed mother. In another matter, I find this one funny. In 1826, Adam Gann was indicted by the grand jury of Roane County, Tennessee. The charge, as you can see here, was for living with a woman he was not married to. The grand jury stated they lived in open and notorious lewdness together, bedding and cohabiting without good morals and against the peace and dignity of the community. Now, Adam, this just shows you what kind of scalawags these guys are. Adam had a couple of his friends, John Brown and Parson Cardwell. They committed themselves to a bail for Adam of $500. So they put up $500 to guarantee that Adam would show up for his court hearings. But Adam skipped town with his lady love, never to be seen again. And in a deposition in another case in 1832, his brother-in-law, Adam Royals, testified that Adam Gann left the county with another man's wife and moved to the Cherokee Nation. So a lot of soap opera going on. You can see here in the second filing at the bottom of the page, oops, is that it? There, that he left John Brown to pay the $500 bail. And if you think about $500 in 1832, that was a ton of money. So anyway, let me tell you about my grandpa's grandpa, William Chamberlain Gann. He was born in Missouri, but came to California in the 1850s. He had an eye for good horse flesh, but he lacked respect for other men's ownership rights. In 1862, he was living in Mariposa, and he took another man's horse under cover of darkness. The sheriff tracked him down and arrested him for larceny. He broke out of the Mariposa jail while he was awaiting trial and stole another horse to try to make his getaway. The sheriff went after him right away and caught him and brought him back to jail. So here's his court docket. There it says that he was, this is in the Mariposa Gazette, showing that he was scheduled for trial for the theft of the horse on April 20th, was then separately scheduled for trial for breaking out of jail on April 23rd. They didn't go well for him, and things didn't go well for him, and he was convicted on all charges. He was sent to San Quentin because he had broken out of the local jail, so they figured they had to be more serious. So here's his mugshot. That comes from the prison files. So I will leave it to you. I'm kind of proud of the fact that I have a mugshot. I think there's not a lot of people who could say that. But I'll leave it up to you how good that is. Anyway, it can be, that's just sort of a taste of the kinds of information that you can find in court records and places you can go to look for. So, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Anybody have any questions for us?
On a more recent situation, how would you obtain something from the 80s, 90s?
For 80s and 90s, they'll be in the local archives. If it's a civil case, that the courts will have a local archives. It's pretty accessible. Like I know in Fresno, the courts were downtown and the court archives was about 3 miles away, so it's still there. If you go back further than that, they will get shipped off-site and they'll have to identify them, and they'll have somebody have to go and find them. And at that point, they might start charging you for looking for them.
Right.
But if it's a recent thing, now if it's a real recent thing, in the last couple of years, and so there's still time for, it may still be open to resolve final issues or final post-trial motions and stuff like that, or it may be up on appeal, then the file will stay in your local court, right, at your local courthouse.
So older records, say in Alameda County, would a mugshot be something that's available?
The mugshot for all the mugshots for San Quentin are available in Sacramento. They have it, I'm gonna stumble here and try to remember which group it is. I will find out which government building I went to. But they had all these books. They had 9 mugshots on a page. And, but it also had all the booking stuff when they booked him in and what he was booked in for and stuff like that. It was sort of like a ledger. So there was the picture book and there was the ledger book. And I want to say State Archives.
State Archives.
And a lot of those things have websites now that you can go to.
I'm finding that they have to wait for that period of time for it to become archived. So I'm smacking that little sweet spot where I can't get any information out of anybody.
It may be that for things that are very current, unless you have what the courts consider to be a reason for getting it because you're involved somehow. Just curiosity would just sort of get you into court records.
Any other questions? I might put a plug in for doing some of this research, especially when you start getting back into earlier records. Sometimes the only way to find a woman's maiden name is if you could find some of these probate records or land records, wills and deeds that might list her, like she was saying, she found the one ancestor listed as the child before she was married. And so sometimes to know who their parents who were is one of the things you can find out. So that's one of the things I found out through probate records. There's also Superior Court records. I was surprised in researching my own family. So I went to the Superior Court clerk's office here in Tulare County. I was kind of tracing down my great-grandmother. She passed away before I came along, so I really didn't know a whole lot about her history. What I was surprised to find out, in the 1870s, she divorced her first husband because he was so abusive. Now, if you think of the 1800s and what the possibility or prospects were for a woman to divorce her husband in that time period, it was very difficult. I say good for her because unfortunately, what happened to those kids, that wasn't my great-grandfather. She divorced him and then married my great-grandfather a few years later after showing he had 2 kids. But the only way I found that out was to research the court records, and fortunately for me, they were here in Tulare County. So there's some amazing things, sometimes on the lower end, like she was saying, but hey, sometimes the way you find records is things they've done that aren't so nice, and then they make the papers, or they make the court records. So if you haven't done that, look into some of these records, you might find
If you do genealogy, you always have to be prepared to find something maybe you didn't have time. So,
okay, any other more questions, or maybe
I had one, one of my grandfathers on my mom's side was adopted, and we had the papers, the adoption papers, where he was adopted to Lutheran child care place, and we had his birth parents and all, mom and dad's name were actually on that paper. So we went to the county, and I don't know what year this was, but he was born like in 1892. And they had the file. We had the file right over. The lady had it right at her desk. Had the name of it, but she would not. She said, "Well, if you wait around this afternoon, if the judge says you can get in," and she knew we were just looking for genealogy. And she said, "Well, I'll look at it and see if there's looks like there's anything." in there that might be valuable. Probably not, so we didn't stay, and then later on I checked, and it's my understanding that they moved those old ones out of the courthouse and now they're in the university or something.
It might be, I know a lot of places are digitizing things too, and who knows what depository they go to from there.
Yeah, I think it was, they went to the university down there.
I know recently I heard, I was trying to track down some people, I had a school yearbook from 1875, and I was trying to track down more records that related to the person that was identified in that. And I went all over the place. It was a Catholic school, and it was at that point I found out that all the records from the Catholic province, or the Catholic diocese, and everything had been shipped to St. Louis. Everything from the West Coast is nothing historic is in California. So if you're looking for Catholic records, you got a trip to St. Louis.
I think you have a question.
Curious, my great-grandfather served in the Sequoia School District as the trustee. I just wondered, did the county keep records of pictures? I'm looking for a picture of this man.
Oh, that's interesting. I know that, you know, it would be typical that the courts would have pictures of judges and clerks and stuff, but I don't know how long they keep them. So, good fun.
Right.
Something I might mention is from personal experience too, you mentioned the immigration courts. Well, if you're looking back and trying to find the immigration records on some answers, depending on what time period, there are certain periods in here in Tulare County, up to about the 1930s, when actually volunteers in the past in our room did transcriptions of those immigration records. We have the transcriptions in the room. After that, they were still doing naturalizations in Tulare County, but a few years ago, and believe me, it was like pulling teeth for us to find this out, they were moved from the Tulare County courthouse over to the new courthouse over in Porterville. And if you don't know that, we've had several people come in. When we went there and they said they didn't have them, they said go up to Fresno. Fresno has current immigration records, not the old ones if you're looking for ancestors. So that's just one of the things we talk about, finding out what happened. And sometimes it's not easy, like if it wasn't that someone with our group overheard someone that had been with the courthouse for a while saying, I think they moved them to Portland. I don't know what happened to them. Anyway, so sometimes you gotta keep trying and digging up where those records went to be able to find what you were looking for. So, well, we thank you again.
Oh, thank you.